A very good warm welcome to all of our attendees this morning. So today we are talking about excavations, how to with excavations. Speaking to all of you plumbers out there, we do remember that most of the times when we are working on sites, specifically construction sites, the entire construction regulation is going to affect you depending on the scope of work you're performing. Now, when we say depending on the scope of work, we realize that you are always doing plumbing works when you're on site. Some of you perhaps doing solar work. Many of you are also doing electrical in conjunction with the plumbing. And so there's various items within the construction regulation and various sections that are going to affect you. However, the type of work that you are doing perhaps is going to be the exact same scope on a different site where the construction regulation is not required. And then we might say to ourselves, well, then we do not need to abide by the laws of the construction regulations, particularly when it comes to excavations, because we're not on a construction site. We are perhaps at a private home, or we are in a corporate yard, busy working in excavations in a corporate environment. And thus, it's not a construction site, so we do not need to abide by those regulations. Well, is that true? What regulations are there? What laws are applicable to us as plumbers out in the industry, or any of us for that matter, that need to do excavations or work in excavations? And what is the law requiring from us? How do we go about ensuring our excavations are safe for working inside as well as for the environment around us? Well, the law that we are going to discuss this morning is the General Safety Regulations. Now, this piece of legislation is applicable to every single company. So whether you're in construction, the construction regulations will supersede this as well as support any additional requirements of this legislation. If you are not in the construction area, but you are still working in excavations, well, then this law is 100% applicable to you. You will notice the general safety regulations state that it is a general safety requirement for you if you are working in excavation. So let's take a look at GSR 13 rather, which talks about excavations, and let's go through the how-to of not just the demolition side, but the excavation side in particular. Now, every employer who performs building work, and when we talk about building work, it's not necessarily construction. We are talking about removing of soil, which is called an excavation, and ensuring that any structure in and around that excavation or building work that we are performing is remained stable. Now, necessary precautions must be taken, and this is in the form of either adequate shoring or the correct type of bracing. And we're going to discuss this point by point by going through the entire piece of regulations here from the GSR 13. There's just a few slides that we're going to go through. If you have any questions, we might not be able to take them because there is a lot of information that we're going to discuss today in excavations, but please send through those questions via email or write your question in now on the Toolbox Talk, and Jacques will then ensure that we get those questions through to our email during the course of this week. So what are we essentially saying? If you are working in excavations and you are not in construction, the General Safety Regulations Section 13 has to be abided by. So what are we doing? We are ensuring that precautions are taken in the form of adequate shoring or such other means as may be necessary to do what? To prevent the accidental collapse of any part of the structure or any of an adjoining structure. So let's go through each part of this regulation and see exactly how we are supposed to abide by this piece of legislation. Let's take a look at the very first thing. We understand that we should never work in an unsafe environment. So employers, you are not required or permitted to require any person to work in an unsupported overhanging material or unsupported excavation, which is more than 1.5 meters deep, that has not been adequately shored, as you see on the top left-hand side of your screen, or braced, as you see in the other two pictures, the center and the right-hand side one. Now, why is this a good practice for us to remember? Do we need shoring? Do we need bracing? Well, this all depends on the environment that you are working in. You see, oftentimes you are not able to shore the environment because there's just not enough space for us to take more earth away, because now we are starting to remove earth from areas that require that compacted soil to be there, such as buildings. You're not allowed to shore within a certain meterage from that building. Perhaps you're working next to a road, and we do not want to shore too close to the road and cause a collapse of the road. And so we need to understand the environment that we are working in, and that is why it is so important to do a site visit. Any excavation needs to be understood. And the task or scope of work that you are doing, perhaps putting in piping, doing waste pipage, whatever it is that you're going to be doing in the excavation, may be one part of the scope, but your site-specific scope is also extremely important. So get to the site before quoting for this type of work. You will then need to see if you can just remove additional soil, which is perhaps the tools that you already have on site, or if this is not possible, then you need to have bracing in place. And this is going to obviously come at an extra cost, as you can see in the top center and right pictures. And if this is going to be an additional cost and you have not done a site inspection, well, the client is going to require you to abide by this piece of regulations, even though you have not quoted for it. So please remember, it is your responsibility to get to site, understand this area where you are going to be working in, and then not just the excavation for your own scope of work, but the excavation that is going to impact on the surrounding pieces of equipment, roads, buildings, or any other structures that also need to ensure their stability. So again, we are talking about excavations, especially when they are 1.5 meters deep. So 1.5 meters deep, you must have adequate shoring as well as adequate bracing, depending on the type of environment you are working in. Now, why are we taking these steps to ensure the support shoring or bracing as contemplated in this specific paragraph B? Well, it is to ensure that they are not only strong enough to support the actual sides of the excavation, but can also support the sides of the excavation. And we'll explain this to you in the next slide as well. But if you take a look at the right-hand side of your screen, there are 4 areas in where the excavation can engulf a person working in there, or perhaps collapse that excavation, causing damage to the tools and equipment inside there, or perhaps even damage to the structural integrity of any other piece of equipment or structure that may be supported by this compacted soil. So if you take a look at these 4 areas, we have soil that has been excavated out, perhaps put too close to the excavation, and this could fall back in. But if we've ensured that this is safe, well, there's also another 3 very high risk situations that could cause our excavation to collapse. And you'll see these 3 where the sides of this excavation is now either falling in, collapsing over and engulfing, or perhaps the soft in situ, the soil next to it has not been checked for stability, and this then just crumbles into the excavation. Either of these situations with a person working inside the excavation is extremely dangerous. This could cause death, could cause serious injuries, and also damage to the tools and equipment that we are working with. So this is the necessary steps to ensure the supported structure or the integrity of your actual excavation. Now, this is all in the interest of protecting a person's life, but at the same time, we also need to look at the environment around us. Now, what are we talking about when we look at the environment around us? Well, this is where any excavation that is done could possibly be near or next to some sort of adjoining building, structure, or road that could be affected by the making of an excavation. Now, in this picture that you see here on the left-hand side, we perhaps have a roadway. This might not be a national road, a nice tarred road. It could be a road that is just used for construction vehicles. Now, again, if you're not on a construction site, this could be a site vehicle. So it could be your bakkie that is driving there, not necessarily a 4 or 10-ton truck that might be driving there. It could just be your vehicle that is driving. It could be the client's vehicle that is driving there. All of these make a huge impact on what we call the zone of influence on an excavation. Now, in this picture there that you see, you will notice that there is a 1 meter gap between not the excavation, but the zone of influence, as well as any excavated soil or any pathway used for transport. Now, the reason for this is the shoring, or perhaps in this case, the bracing that has been used for this excavation can support the sides of the excavation. However, it may not be able to handle the amount of weight if the excavated soil is placed on there, or if somebody had to drive with a vehicle over that zone of influence. See, this could perhaps damage your bracing and then cause the entire collapse of that excavation. Now, we are not using this as an absolute rule. Remember, it depends on the width, the depth, the size of your excavation, what adjoining structures, or buildings, or roads are near your environment that you are working in. So again, the importance of doing a site visit before we do any excavation work is extremely important to the planning of a safe excavation. Again, we want to ensure the stability, not just of the actual excavation that we are performing our works in, but also the stability of the building, the structure, the road, or any other person that needs to move in and around that excavation as well. And so proper planning is extremely vital for this type of work. Again, we are talking about an excavation that is just 1.5 meters deep or deeper. So if you're going less than 1.5 meters, does this mean you do not need to look at these things? Well, the principle is there. Any excavation that is done, whether 1.5 meters or deeper, has to abide strictly by these regulations. But any excavation that is less than 1.5 meters still needs to operate within the same parameters. You see, you still don't want any type of excavation to fall. So this type of trench working, where it's less than 1.5 meters, we still want to adhere by the correct shoring procedure, just to make sure that our employees are safe. Remember, this means that we are taking a best practice route. We look at legislation, that is the minimum requirement in terms of the law, and then we look at what is our requirement as a company. We want to keep our employees and our clients safe and ensure that nobody is harmed during our work. Another thing that we do not want to harm is any electric, water, gas, or similar services that may be affected when we are doing excavations. Now, here I want to chat to the plumbers as well as perhaps all of you safety consultants that are also listening in. Please remember that it might not have been quoted for. Now, we have seen this in many instances. A plumber comes through, he asks for schematics or wherever he's going to be performing the works. Nobody knows that there are services in that specific area. The plumber was not required to check this, although this law says you need to ascertain as far as practical the location and nature of electricity. It's not absolute. It's not to say that you had to do that. It is far as practical. And so if you cannot practically see from the surface that there were the location of nature of whether it be electricity, water, gas, or other similar services, you cannot then blame the plumber for not checking this. However, if you could see that in a practical sense, this needed to be checked because it was uncertain, well then you need to ensure that this was in place in your either your mandatory agreement, your scope of work agreement, or perhaps even the quoted scope of works that needed to be done. So as a safety consultant, please do not automatically go to the plumber. We do not want to create a blame game here, but this again showing the vital importance of doing a site visit. So plumbers, if you are going to quote on works, request that the client includes the scanning for services in that quote. And I know sometimes this can be expensive and clients do not want to pay for it. So try and either work this in or ensure that it is written bold on your quote. Now, When I say that, a lot of quotes that I read, it's in the fine print, it's in the small print, and we know that oftentimes people are not reading this. We know it because we don't even read it ourselves, all the fine print or the T's and C's. But it almost feels like we're trying to hide it until something happens, and then we will pull out the quote and say, well, it is in the fine print. Let's rather be upfront and open with our clients. Remember, this is in the interest of protecting not only your client, your reputation, your employees that are working there, because if it's in the fine print and you send an employee to do excavation, and perhaps he's doing it manually with a pick and a spade and a shovel, and he contacts an electric cable, well, yes, there's going to be a court case on who said, who should have, what's in the quote, but what does it really come down to? It's the life of that employee who was put in danger because of those services that were not checked. So we agree that there are contractual requirements, but let us supersede that with the life of an individual who is going in to perform works to support his family that we should ensure is safe while performing his tasks. So be open and honest, and as clients or safety consultants that are listening in, request this information. Before any construction or excavation rather that is being taken or being done on your site, request that any location of services has been done, has been checked to ensure that not only are those services looked after, but the employees working on that excavation are kept safe from the dangers of those services. Now, what about the safe access to these excavations? Again, we're taking a look at something that is more than 1.5 meters deep, but we need to have convenient and safe means of access to any excavation where a person has to work in that is more than 1.5 meters deep. Now, if it is longer than 50 meters, please remember we do not want to extend any of our access areas to more than 50 meters. In other words, if you have a 100-meter excavation, you will have 3 entrances or 3 safe means of access. You'll have one at the beginning, that is 0 meters. Then you will have one at 50 meters, and then you will have one at 100 meters. So you can change this to have 2 points of access, 50 meters. Obviously, from one side, you will then start at 20 and put another one at 70. And thus you have 2 almost in the middle of the excavation. Again, how is this done? By proper planning. The safe access that we are requiring, though, is to ensure that a person can climb into an excavation and out of an excavation safely, which means any access, if in this case you are using a ladder, must protrude past the safe grounding or landing platform for any employee at least a minimum of 1 meter. And that must also reach all the way down so that a person can always maintain 3 points of contact on this ladder. If it's a scaffolding, well, we want to walk onto the scaffolding platform from the level of the actual ground. So we never want the scaffold to be higher or lower than where we are walking, unless you are going to provide adequate steps within the scaffolding as well. Again, proper planning, site inspections need to be done to ascertain this type of information. Now, if you see in this picture, you notice that there is one item that may be unsafe for this employee, and that is where he climbs out of a excavation to an area that is less than 1 meter wide from the stacking and storing of articles, tools, equipment, or perhaps even the excavation or excavated soil itself. So again, we want to make sure that there is a minimum of 1 meter protruding above the safe landing point, as well as a 1 meter width away from anything that is stacked or stored near this excavation. In fact, we want to ensure that barricading or barriers are up instead to ensure that nothing is stacked or stored near this excavation or within 1 meter of that safe access, so that it does not create an obstruction to the egress or access of that excavated soil. Then We also take a look at any excavation that is 1.5 meter deep or deeper has to be inspected by a person who is competent. Now, what is competency? Well, we understand that this is a person who has the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities, in particular, to excavations. So generally, it would be a person that has experience in excavations, perhaps that is not just got the skills and knowledge, but also the ability in terms of a competency certificate from an accredited provider that explains how excavations should be kept safe, should be shored, should be braced, as well as inspected, and when it must inspected. Now, this should at least be done once before every shift. Again, we are talking about at least. A minimum requirement is that all excavations are checked before a shift and before the commencement of any work and after any inclement weather, specifically in this case rain. And that is because all the shoring that we are perhaps doing, or any of the soil could have eroded, creating environments or pockets where the soil around the excavation can then collapse. So if you are working in an excavated area that is 1.5 meters deep or deeper, who has done those inspections? And when we talk about a regulated or government regulated specific inspection, like we're talking about your GSR 13 checklist, we are talking about a documented checklist. It's not something that a person walks in, takes a few photos and walks away. It is a specific checklist for that excavation to ensure all of the requirements of this piece of legislation is adhered to. Now, second lastly is, in this case, is any excavation must be adequately protected by a barrier or a fence. It must be at least 1 meter high and as close to the excavation as is practical. Now, when we say as close to, this could be 1 meter away from the excavated soil. In the case that you're seeing here in the picture, it is right on top of the actual excavation, and that is to ensure that a person is adequately climbing out of this excavation, but is not able to fall in to that excavation. So remember, if a person climbs out of an excavation, you want to put a barrier between him and the excavation itself. So in terms of the ladder, if a person climbs out of an excavation and he climbs off the ladder, he should not be able to fall back. And so the ladder access then should allow for him to walk, get behind the barrier, and then proceed either to other parts of the site or perhaps to his vehicle or any laydown area. And so this adequately protected barrier or fence, what does this really mean? We see oftentimes we are just putting danger tape down. Is this adequate? Well, on some sites, danger tape is required, but how far must danger tape be placed on an excavation? Well, a lot of people will dispute this, but if you could think about it logically, we are talking about adequate barrier or fencing. Now, why are we talking about an adequate barrier or fence? Is this just to show that there's an excavation? Yes, for one, it is to show that there is an excavation there. But secondly, if somebody trips and falls, you are obviously moving toward the excavation. Will that barrier or fence that you put up stop the person from falling and rolling in to that excavation? Now you can ask yourself, will red barrier tape do that? Not necessarily. Nobody has fallen against red barrier tape and stopped. So you would want to move this perhaps a meter or meter and a half to 2 meters, depending on the space that you have, away from that excavation, so that you can still see that you shouldn't cross this piece of barrier tape. But if I fell and I fell past the barrier tape, there is still sufficient enough ground for me not to fall and fall into the excavation. So this is just something logical. If we can put up scaffolding right around it, if a person fell, he would then fall against that scaffold and then stop from falling into the actual excavation. So again, do a site visit. Are you using a barrier? Is it sufficient? Is it adequate? Are you using a fence? Is it sufficient? Is it adequate? And is it at least 1 meter high? So finally, we take a look at the last piece of legislation under GSR 13 is to be provided with red warning lights or any other clearly visible boundary indicators at night or when visibility conditions are poor. Again, this is very often used with road markings, but if an excavation is going to be opened during the evenings and there is still access to and from or around that excavation, please remember that that barrier or fence that you are putting up might not be adequate in warning people at night or when visibility conditions are poor. And so you need to still ensure that red warning lights or other clearly visible boundary indicators are present around your excavation. So we hope this helps you to a degree with your current excavation works. Perhaps you are a plumber who is working this week in excavation. Maybe you're working next week or coming up throughout the year. Or maybe you have worked in excavations and realized that there were a few things missing. Well, now is the time to make our notes. Remember that the next time we do this type of work, we want to ensure that not only our employees are safe, but any other person, structure, piece of equipment, or any services that might be affected by that excavation is kept safe. Again, we want to remember a life is more important. And ensuring that our employees are kept safe should be our number one priority. So as we mentioned, we are taking a little bit extra time today, so we apologize for that, but we will still end this Toolbox Talk off at 7:30. So there's not much time for questions. Please, if you do have a question, reach out to us, info@ohss.co.za, chris@ohss.co.za, or safety@iopsa.org. You can also contact us on 071-875-2070, and you can get in touch with us through the IOPSA website as well. Just please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you about what is happening and what type of risks are you finding out there that need to be mitigated. Looking at next week's Toolbox Talk, we are going to be discussing the hazardous environment of working on scaffolding. What should we be doing there and what type of legislation affects us? So thank you very much for joining us this morning.